Somewhere behind your eyes, dead center in your skull, sits a gland roughly the size of a grain of rice. And in a large share of adults, a brain scan of that gland shows something almost unsettling. A small, hardened lump, visible on an X-ray, the same way a stone shows up in an image of a kidney. Doctors have a clinical, almost bored word for this: calcification. It's common enough that radiologists sometimes use it as a landmark, a reliable little marker that helps them orient the rest of a brain scan. Yogic tradition has a very different name for roughly the same patch of real estate: the third eye. This gland is called the pineal gland, named for its faint resemblance to a tiny pine cone. Tucked deep in the brain, almost exactly between the two hemispheres, it does one job that modern medicine is fairly confident about, and at least one other that gets a lot more attention online than the evidence actually supports. Let's start with the part that's settled. The pineal gland produces melatonin, a hormone that rises in darkness and falls in daylight, and functions as one of your body's main timekeepers for sleep. It receives that light information indirectly through a signaling pathway connected to your eyes, which is a strange thing to sit with. A gland buried deep inside solid bone, with no direct exposure to light at all, still somehow knows whether it's day or night outside. The pathway itself is almost absurdly roundabout once you trace it. Light hits specialized cells in your retina, which send a signal not toward the visual centers of your brain, but down through a small structure in the hypothalamus, then along a chain of nerves that exits the skull entirely, travels down the side of the neck, and finally re-enters the head to reach the gland itself. Sever that pathway anywhere along its route, and the pineal gland stops reliably tracking day and night, even though nothing has touched the eyes or the gland directly. It's less a straight wire than a long, looping cable, and evolution apparently never bothered to shorten it. Over the decades, in a large number of people, calcium phosphate slowly deposits inside pineal tissue, forming small granules anatomists sometimes call corpora arenacea, brain sand in plainer English. By the time many people reach their 40s or 50s, a portion of the gland has quietly turned into something closer to fine gravel than soft tissue. Nobody fully agrees on why this happens faster in some people than others. Here's a detail almost nobody brings up when they talk about the third eye, and it has nothing to do with mysticism at all. In several living reptiles, including a New Zealand species called the Tuatara, there is a literal third eye. A small light-sensitive spot sits directly on top of the skull, complete with a rudimentary lens and retina, wired to the same region of the brain that in mammals becomes the pineal gland. It doesn't form images. It mostly tracks the length of the day and the position of the sun, feeding that information into the same kind of circadian timekeeping your own pineal gland handles today. Evolutionary biologists consider the human pineal gland and this reptilian parietal eye to be, in a real anatomical sense, related structures. Descendants of the same ancient light-sensing tissue, one retained as a literal eye, the other tucked inward and repurposed as a gland. Long before any tradition used the phrase poetically, something resembling a third eye already existed, quite literally, on the heads of our evolutionary cousins. Back in your own skull, though, one specific line of research into why human pineal tissue calcifies is worth mentioning honestly, without dressing it up. In 2001, a researcher named Jennifer Luke completed a doctoral study at the University of Surrey, examining fluoride levels in different human tissues after death. She found that pineal tissue accumulated fluoride at concentrations far higher than most other soft tissue in the body, and that fluoride appeared alongside the calcium deposits inside calcified glands. That finding is real, published, and often repeated. What gets added on top of it, almost every time it circulates online, usually isn't. The idea that this represents some coordinated effort to suppress spiritual awakening is a claim this video isn't going to make, because there's no credible evidence for it. And repeating it without that caveat would be doing exactly the kind of thing this channel tries not to do. The narrower, better supported version is simpler and, frankly, still strange enough on its own. A mineral already debated on entirely separate public health grounds also happens to show up in unusually high concentrations in the one gland that regulates your sleep. Now here's where two very different traditions, centuries and continents apart, start pointing at the same real estate in your skull. In 1649, the French philosopher René Descartes published a book called The Passions of the Soul, and in it, he made a claim that startled even his contemporaries. He proposed that the pineal gland was the literal seat of the soul, the single physical point in the entire human body where mind and matter met and communicated. Descartes had no concept of melatonin, no notion of calcification, nothing resembling modern neuroscience. He simply noticed that this was the only structure in the brain that didn't appear to exist as a symmetrical left and right pair, and reasoned that a unified consciousness needed a single unified physical home. It's worth pausing on how strange that reasoning actually was for its time. Descartes was, by most accounts, one of the most rigorous rationalists Europe had produced, deeply suspicious of anything resembling mysticism. And yet here he was, dissecting animal brains by candlelight, arriving at a conclusion about the soul's physical address that reads, today, almost exactly like a piece of esoteric doctrine. He wasn't borrowing from Eastern philosophy. As far as historians can tell, he had no exposure to it at all. He simply looked at the one unpaired structure in the brain and made an intuitive leap that happened to land in the same general neighborhood several other traditions had already been quietly circling. Roughly 1,000 years earlier and several thousand miles east, an entirely separate tradition had already been mapping something onto almost the same location. In classical tantric texts, such as the Satchakra Nirupana, a 16th century treatise on the subtle body, later translated into English by the scholar Arthur Avalon, the Ajna Chakra is described as sitting at the point between the eyebrows, deep within the head, often depicted in accompanying iconography as a two-petaled lotus, the fewest petals given to any center in the entire system. Ajna translates roughly as command or perception beyond the ordinary senses. It's the center traditionally associated with intuition, inner vision, and what later popular language would come to call the third eye. It would be dishonest to claim this text was describing the pineal gland specifically, the way a modern anatomy textbook would. It wasn't. The Ajna Chakra, in its original context, is a subtle energy center, not a physical organ cataloged through dissection. The specific equation between Ajna and pineal gland is a modern one, popularized largely in the 19th and 20th centuries by Western esoteric writers who were, by their own admission, drawing a bridge between older symbolic language and newer anatomical discovery. The psychiatrist and researcher Rick Strassman, known for his clinical studies on the compound DMT, has speculated in his own writing that the pineal gland might play some role in profound subjective states. He's also been consistently clear, in his own words, that this remains a hypothesis, not an established finding. So here is the honest version of the convergence, without the embellishment. A 17th century French rationalist dissecting brains alone by candlelight, a centuries-older tantric map of the subtle body passed down through teachers rather than laboratories. Neither one had access to melatonin research, fluoride studies, or a single microscope slide of calcified pineal tissue. And both independently singled out this exact structure as somehow more central to consciousness than anything surrounding it. Here's where most content about this topic quietly goes off the rails. A large corner of the wellness internet sells the idea that specific supplements, foods, or rituals can dissolve pineal calcification and restore some lost spiritual faculty. Raw cacao, certain iodine protocols, fluoride-free water on its own marketed as a kind of undoing. The honest answer is that no rigorous clinical evidence currently shows any of these reliably reversing calcification once it's formed. Once calcium phosphate has deposited into tissue, the body doesn't generally have a mechanism for quietly redissolving it and clearing it away. In the pineal gland or anywhere else, calcification shows up. Some small studies suggest more heavily calcified glands may correlate with somewhat lower melatonin output later in life, but the research is mixed. Sample sizes are often small, and nobody credible is claiming a proven fix, which raises the obvious question. If dissolving the stone isn't something science can currently promise you, is there anything actually worth doing here? There is, and it's less dramatic than a supplement, which is probably why it gets so little attention. The function of this gland, regardless of how much of it has calcified, still depends heavily on the signal it receives about light and darkness. Bright light exposure, particularly in the morning, in genuine darkness at night, appear to matter more for healthy melatonin rhythm than almost anything else studied. Modern life tends to invert both halves of that equation. dim, artificial light in the morning, and bright screens deep into the night, right when this gland is trying to read the darkness as a cue to begin its work. So here's tonight's practice, alongside a companion for tomorrow morning, since this is one of the rare cases where the evening alone isn't the whole story. Tonight, in the hour before you sleep, dim the lights in your space as much as is practical, and set your phone or any screen aside earlier than you normally would. If you need light for a bathroom or hallway, let it be warm and dim rather than the cool white glow most homes default to. You're not performing a ritual here. You're simply giving a very old, very literal light sensor the dark signal it evolved to expect. Uninterrupted by the small blue-toned suns most of us now carry in our pockets until the moment we close our eyes. Tomorrow morning, step outside within the first half hour of waking, if you can, and let actual daylight reach your eyes for several minutes without sunglasses. Overcast counts. Even a few minutes on a cloudy morning delivers far more usable light than an indoor room ever will. And that morning signal appears to matter just as much as the evening darkness for keeping the whole rhythm anchored correctly. This single pair of habits, done consistently across weeks rather than a single night, is about as close as legitimate science currently gets to directly supporting the gland the old traditions once called the seat of the soul. Nobody can promise you it dissolves anything already hardened inside your skull. What it can do, according to the research that actually exists, is help the part of the gland still working do its job a little better. Somewhere behind your eyes, there's a small gland that a 17th century philosopher called the seat of the soul, and an older tradition on the far side of the world once called an eye of a different kind. Both were pointing, it turns out, at the exact same small, quietly hardening piece of you. Whether or not it ever fully turns to stone, it's still listening tonight for the difference between light and dark. That much at least you can still speak to.